Hi, welcome to the Avrum Rosensweig show. Of course, I am Avrum Rosensweig, and I am really delighted to be here with you. I welcome all of my viewers. As you know, it's predominantly a resurrection of my podcast. Over the last few years, I did close to 100. Stopped for a little bit, and here I am back. If you've been watching recently, you'll know that the focus of my podcast is what I'm calling ordinary people with super ordinary or extraordinary stories that are stimulating and that are inspiring. I am of the belief that we live in an absolutely beautiful world with some pockmarks, no doubt. And within our world, when you search, when you probe, when you go out there and you decide, I'm going to meet people, speak with people, what you discover very quickly is everybody has a gift, everybody has a talent, and everybody has a narrative and a story. So, since the inception of the newest iteration of my podcast, I've spoken to people like Dr. Bradley Strauss, who is a Toronto cardiologist, happens to be mine, and he is a Zionist, quasi-Zionist. He's an individual who is just so passionate about our Israel. And when October 7th occurred, he said to himself, what am I doing here? And he jumped on a plane and he went and he volunteered for free in a hospital in Israel. Recently, I spoke with Noah Braun, who is the founder and the CEO of Israel's Guide Dog Center for the Blind. He's a very, very compelling individual. He started it out of a deep, deep love for animals, but more so wanting to help people who are visually impaired and otherwise. And we talked about the impact of dogs on Israeli society and basically how they've been used as a tool, if you will, after October 7th to try to make especially younger people, children, feel a little bit better about what they had gone through. If anyone's ever been licked by a Labrador retriever, you know what I'm talking about. They can lick you right into life. There's many other interviews that I've worked on and I'm working on. And 2 weeks from now, I'll be speaking with Hillel Halkin, who is really a world-renowned Israeli author, brilliant fellow. And I'm very much looking forward to having a talk with him about the complexity of Israel today and his life. Now, today, I'm also very honored to have with me, I'd like to say my dear friend, and hopefully we can say that in a few months from now, David Suissa. How are you, David?
I'm great. It's great to be here.
I'm very honored to have you. David is the editor and publisher of the Jewish Journal of Los Angeles. He's very high profile. If you go on the internet, you'll find a lot of him engaging in debates, engaging in interviews. Recently, he traveled to Israel and he did his very best to do a fact-finding mission for himself, for the newspaper, and for the city of Los Angeles, and no doubt the state and United States of America. He wrote some beautiful stuff, which we are going to refer to throughout our interview. But let's get going. I want to just start, David, by saying, at let's say our stage of life. I'm 63. How old are you?
About around there.
Okay, yeah, around there. Yeah, good. And I think it's safe to say that we've both read a lot, be it books and articles and poems, etc. And at some point in time, you kind of arrive at a juncture in your life where you say, yeah, this is the type of writer that I want to read. This is someone who really touches my heart, makes me think. And when I read a particular piece that you had written about your recent trip to Israel called The Limits of Language, I thought, you know what? I'm going to keep on reading this guy. Basically, what I'm saying is you're a wonderful writer.
Oh, thank you.
You really are. You're a wonderful writer. Do you know that about yourself?
When I grew up in Montreal, I was this classic immigrant from Morocco.
Yeah.
And I was 8 years old, grade 3. And for some reason, I fell in love with the English language.
Yeah.
And I also fell in love with newspaper columnist. Montreal, there was this guy, Michael Farber, and Red Fisher, and Michael Boone. There was something about newspaper columnist that always held my interest. And then I fell in love with Bill Safire in the New York Times.
Yes.
I read everything he wrote for 30 years. So I always had this deep attachment to newspaper columnist. So I took a detour and I went into marketing and advertising for 30 years, but I kind of came back to my first love, which is journalism. And the truth is, being a weekly columnist is a long time love affair. So I'm in total heaven. I've been writing a weekly column for 17 years in LA. I haven't missed a week.
It's hard, isn't it, writing a weekly?
It was hard in the beginning. And then after a while, you realize that it just never leaves you.
Yes.
So wherever I go around town, I'm constantly thinking about my column.
Right. And when you come up with a concept, because I wrote a column for the Canadian Jewish News for 20 years, when you're walking along the street, as you say, and you meet somebody or you see something happening, you think to yourself, yeah, this is a good one. And do you jot it down as an article idea?
No, I don't jot it down. Sometimes it's going to be on Shabbat. Uh, Other times it's going to just log into my head and when I get home. But actually, I don't do too much taking notes.
Right.
What I'll do is I might take a contact info. That I do. I'll say, I need your text information. And the one thing I learned is texting is a million times better than email.
Oh,
So
yes. No question.
interested. I said, okay, I'll text you later this week. But the ideas come all the time. And also when I read what's going on in the world, what was happening in Israel is I found it very hard to talk.
Yeah.
So I've been going to Israel for, I don't know, 40 years and nonstop. And one thing I do in Israel is I'm constantly talking. I'm talking and I'm analyzing, and I have my favorite cafe on Emek Refaim, and I have all my great buddies there, and we have these amazing conversations. I've even written about the quality of conversations that I find, especially in Jerusalem.
Yes.
And I found that this year the words just weren't coming to me. I didn't really feel like talking. I
Well,
felt that
sorry,
I,
go ahead.
I felt that what happened on October 7th was so transcendental. It was almost biblical. It was on some other complete other level of reality. It's almost surreal. It was so big, so overwhelming that I felt that I needed to just keep my mouth shut so I could start to feel it better. I was having meetings with friends of mine, and one of them was telling me, he went to a wedding, next day he went to a burial, and I was just all these horror stories. I was staying in a hotel, and hundreds of people were refugees, and so it was just, and I think I can safely say that you and I and every Jew I've ever met has never experienced something like October 7th. Never.
David, I want to take this opportunity. It's a good segue just to read a paragraph or two from the article that you wrote called "The Limits of Language." Before I do, what is your favorite cafe on Ha'emek?
Oh my God. It used to be Aroma, but now I go to Pompidou.
What do you order?
Well, first of all, I'm a coffee addict.
Yeah.
So I'm literally a coffee addict, I have to confess. But then they have a couple of salads that I ordered for lunch there. I spend like 8 hours there, like one meeting after another. I took off to see Yitz Greenberg, who lived not far, and I came back and I had more meetings. I'm kind of I'm that, you know, uh, addicted to Jerusalem coffee. It's one of my great pleasures in
Yeah.
life.
Cafe Hafuch, right? Where they boil the milk first. It's wonderful,
Well,
isn't it?
no, now I do Americano with a side of
Americano.
oat milk. Yeah.
Yeah. You have good friends too, I can see. So David is again the publisher and editor in chief of the Jewish Journal in LA. And within that, he writes a column on a weekly basis. This is a piece that he wrote after October 7th, and I'll just read you a couple of paragraphs. It's humbling when you make a living by choosing the right words and something happens when those words fail you. There are no words, is the common cliche we use when something overwhelms us. This tragedy is so horrible. This art is so sublime. This emotion is so intense. There are no words. But in truth, even saying there are no words is a choice of words. If there really were no words to describe this thing or that, we would just say nothing. Over the past 4 weeks of my visit to Israel, I often found myself tongue-tied by the enormity of October 7th. The scope of the massacres, the intimacy of the barbarity were so overwhelming it felt lame to use ordinary language. Words give you a sense of control over something. If I can describe it, if I can analyze it, if I can label it, the event will not own me. I will own it. Have the words come back since?
Well, that's the irony, is that I have to go that deep into the limits of language to find the language. And eventually, I remember there was a trip to Israel like years ago, and maybe because I come from the advertising business, and it was like a challenge for the whole month. I said, I'm going to come up with 2 or 3 words to describe this crazy country, literally. It took me a month. By the time I was done, I remember I was meeting with Mika Goodman, and I said, Mika, I think I have it. He said, what is it? I said, this is a mess in progress.
Nice one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
said, I loved it. I loved it. It took me a good month. And I was walking on Emek between 2 meetings. I was going to an ATM. I said, why am I having trouble? Why can't I grasp what's happening now in Israel? And I have my son was basketball junkie and played basketball for like 20 years, and I would take him constantly. And he had a coach once, and during the off season, you'd say you have to practice like taking thousands of shots if you want to improve your 3-point shooting. You just got to take thousands of them, and then by the time you get to a pressured game, you have what's called muscle memory,
Yes.
and the muscle memory takes over. So I was walking on Emek Rephaim, and I was reflecting on what I was seeing for a few weeks, this ability to kind of move on and do what you need to do. On the one hand, you're not paralyzed by shiva or by numbness, but on the other hand, you're not like raw. It was like that space somewhere in the middle, and I realized this is what I'm noticing in Israel. It's muscle memory. And this is the muscle of survival that's gotten 75 years of experience. And it's the only phrase that I was happy with, that I came up with. And that's where the article ended up going. I said, this country's on muscle memory right now.
Yes. I came up with a explanation of myself a few years ago, more or less a movement which I coined. I call it dishevelism. And I'm the president of the dishevelism movement. I'm a mess in progress. I really am. It's like tohu vavohu, in the Torah.
Yeah,
Do you see yourself as a mess in progress?
yeah, I do. And I was also looking for a word I'd never used before, you see,
Yeah.
because there are a lot of words that are really accurate and true. For example, resiliency.
Yeah.
It's true and it's accurate, but it's been used a million times. I felt that because October 7th was so otherworldly, I just needed to find a word that I've never used before. And I think muscle memory was trying to get me there. And I also felt that the less I was speaking and describing and labeling, the closer I was getting to to my people, to my people in Israel. So yeah, disheveled, mess in progress. I think it's kind of the charm of the Jewish people, of Judaism. We are a mess, and one of the reasons we're a mess is because we allow for liberty of expression. Somebody could look at the Talmud and say it's kind of messy because all
Mm.
these different opinions are allowed, right? And then somebody could look at what's going on college campuses right now. Say this is not messy. This is control freak. This is you're only allowed to say this, and you have to sign this kind of statement. That's not messy at all. That's controlling. So I think I see the word mess in a very positive light. Uh, and somebody might look at the messiness of Israeli discourse. Yeah, but if you compare it to the absence of any discourse in another country, in the neighborhood, I'll take that mess any day.
Yeah, well, what really interested me about you in terms of how you see the world is that you come up with very interesting phrases like labels that you use. And I'm thinking, and tell me if I'm correct, that you use in order for you to be able to understand our existence. I'll give you an example. You have a phrase, the voice of observation, right? Voice of observation, and you use that a number of times in many different interviews. I'll leave that up to you to define. And another one, which is classic to you, is corrective mechanism.
Mhm.
And that refers to Israel's too. Tell us what those two are.
Well, I'll start with corrective mechanism. I think it's one of the most crucial concepts that if you understand Western society and the great ideals of the Enlightenment and the creation of America and Israel, if you look at the U.S. Constitution, you know, it didn't preclude slavery. It realized that slavery was built in, and but what it did is there was a corrective mechanism that was built into the Constitution, which somebody like Abraham Lincoln saw, and it's the corrective mechanism that is really the most powerful part of a democracy. So you have a lot of ills and you have a lot of problems and inequities and injustices. But Martin Luther King did not say we have to get rid of our system. He said, I want to cash a check because in the Declaration of Independence, where man is created equal, the ideals are already set up. So the corrective mechanism is built in. I would have to say that's one of the most important factors in a democracy. Israel as well has the corrective mechanism, and it's very, very messy, and it makes a lot of noise. I mean, look at the Civil War that happened was part of the corrective mechanism that enabled America to shed the horror of slavery. The biggest problem today in America is when people reject that corrective mechanism and they say, no, the country is systemically racist. It's irredeemably tainted. And we have to redefine America, not based on the grand ideals of 1776, but the arrival of a boat of slaves in 1619. And what we've seen in the last few years in America is a rejection of the concept of the corrective mechanism. And that's a very disturbing element. Now, and in Israel as well, a democracy is always being challenged because, with human nature gets very angry when things don't go their way. And
True.
if you remember 2023, Israel almost came close to civil war. But I believe that the demonstrations that happened, for 10 months, that was part of the corrective mechanism,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and then the chutzpah of having a 4-seat majority in the Knesset and saying, well, that's enough for us to make constitutional changes on the reallocation of power. There was a chutzpah there, and they got a pushback. I believe that the judicial system needed reform. But if you're going to make these kind of constitutional reform and call it a basic law, you're going to need more than a 1-seat majority. Right. And I think this is what happened in the end is the people had this instinctive desire to push back, and they pushed back. And I think the corrective mechanism was at work. One of the reasons Israel has survived for so long is because they always have these commissions of inquiry
Yes.
after disasters. Brett Stevens said this great thing. Israel, they do really good with failures because they really learn from their failures. And we've had so many of those over the decades after 73 and a lot of these disasters that we've had. And there's going to be another big one obviously, after October 7th. And I think this is what has helped Israel survive and thrive. They have this corrective mechanism. So I'm a huge believer in their corrective mechanism. Bill Clinton had a great line. There's nothing that's wrong with America that something that's right with America can't fix.
Yeah, very good. Find that balance. Do you think the corrective mechanism is its genesis is somewhat Talmudic in nature?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think all of Judaism is a built-in corrective mechanism.
Yeah. Explain
Oh
that.
my God. Well, it's like, first of all, we have this open-endedness. And this idea of embracing different viewpoints. You have Israel and Shammai and these arguments for the sake of heaven. When,
Yes.
when you have an argument for the sake of heaven, there's a certain dignity to that. There's a sense that says, I have faith in our corrective mechanism. And you got 600 years of debate captured in the Talmud, and you feel that everybody is there who's arguing and debating. They all have kind of faith that whatever it is that we're doing is getting us to a better place.
Yes. Yes.
It's there. And whereas I think once you lose that faith in then things start to corrode. Then you have what's the poison of cynicism, where you have no faith that this thing that we're living through called America is going to take us to a better place. You lose that faith. I think Judaism never lost that faith, and I think this is what we gain from the Talmud. We don't lose the faith that our ability to listen to each other and argue even vehemently is eventually going to get us to a better place.
Let's go back to October 7th. In the simplest terms, David Suissa, what the hell happened?
Well, it's a perfect storm of, you know, the worst possible things that can happen. They all happened. So you have the arrogance of trying to assume that you know what Hamas is about. And because Israel was giving them 10,000 working permits, we bought the, the story that they were really interested in improving their economy. And then too much faith on high tech. And we lost sight. Israel lost sight of the ball. They put all this extra effort in the Judea and Samaria. It was it makes me dizzy, Avrum, that for like 50 years we're used to hearing these disasters, right? A bus blows up, Israel loses 5. A shooting, Israel loses 2. Another horrible terrorist attack, Israel loses 6. And then literally for decade after decade after decade, we're used to these horrible events where you'll have Israel loses 6 or 2. Even when Israel loses one, we hear that the whole country's sitting shiva
Yes.
for this one victim of terror, right? This is what our brain was used to for 50 years. And every time it was a disaster. All of a sudden, one day, it's Simchat Torah and it's Shabbat, and we lose 1,400
Yeah.
in one day, right? One of the things that we're all used to about Israel is the obsession with security. They would do anything to protect the safety of their people. So inside all these kibbutzim and all these towns, 20 towns. So it was so crazy. And it was such a monumental breakdown of the security. And of course, look, we're gonna see the report, all of us, but we're already getting a sense of what happened, that they overlooked a lot of the red flags and the signs that something was going to happen. But I mean, hindsight is 2020, and we're going to learn that it was by far the biggest security breakdown in Israeli history. And also, I have to blame some of the leadership, because there was always an interest in keeping Hamas strong, so that as long as Hamas and Abbas and the Palestinian Authority were at each other's throat, there could never be really peace or a two-state solution. So there's a lot of that that's going to happen in the final report as well. And look, I used to think that the strategy of mowing the lawn was not that bad. It was like every few years you got to mow the lawn. But I guess we overlooked the fact that this was a terror army. We used to assume they're just a terror group, and it was a terror army. And we're seeing now the extent of the danger that they created with these thousands of kilometers of tunnels and really really sophisticated army, and they got GPS drones from Iran, which helped them, neutralize all these security towers. And then, I guess we overlooked the fact that once you neutralize them, then all your observation is like debilitated. So you can't see what's going on. And that's what gave the enemy, 8 to 10 hours to massacre and to do their damage. And they came in, I mean, thousands of them. It was just the biggest nightmare ever is what happened. And we're going to learn what happened. And the only silver lining is that Israel really knows how to learn from its mistakes. I think this is going to be one of those lessons that's going to last 100 years. I think it's going to be talked about by our grandchildren and our great grandchildren. I think it's one of those forever and ever lessons. I think the collective trauma is going to linger for a long, long, long time. I mean, you and I, right? I don't know you that well, but I can assure you that the trauma of the October War of 1973, we we all grew up with it. They attacked us on Yom Kippur. So that was the trauma of traumas. And now October 7th has made Yom Kippur look small by comparison. So I
Was
think,
was October 7th a pogrom?
oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah. October 7th was, look, as a journalist, we always kind of look at the breadth and the depth and the enormity of stories.
Yeah.
During 2020, the COVID, the way this tiny little thing that's 10,000 times smaller than a grain of salt took over humanity. I said this is the biggest story of our time.
Yes.
And I meant it then. And this is by far, at the Jewish Journal, we've never had two cover stories on the same subject. After October 7th, we had 9 in a row.
Yes.
So it's bigger than big. And yeah, it's pogrom. There is no way to exaggerate October 7th. I have seen kind of leftist Jews who are usually, classic friends of mine on the left. They go to J Street. They usually, they love to take the side of Palestinians, Tikkun Olam, the classic leftist Jews who lost their minds on October 7th.
Yeah.
They really lost their minds because so many Jews have children and they can't unring the bell. So the images and the stories that we all heard of, families being burned alive and the rapes and the mutilation were so overwhelming that many Jews kind of lost their minds. And I have to add one more thing, which is in America. The week after October 7th, before Israel did anything in Gaza, the word was our children and grandchildren were really afraid of walking on college campuses. So it was the combination of the horror of having, more than 1,200 of our brethren murdered in Israel. And at the same time,
Mhm.
the Jewish college students are the bad guys. They're the ones that are afraid. I think the combination of those two things really brought the Jews together like I've never seen before.
Did you metaphorically or otherwise crawl into bed after October 7th? I asked that because I myself became almost like you were saying before, almost
No.
unable to speak.
Well, I was in Montreal. I was doing Simchat Torah in Montreal. And my daughter, who goes to NYU, she met me in Montreal and we're ready to go to New York for the week. So the way the Jewish Journal works is by Sunday, we kind of know what our cover story is going to be. And then we wrap things up Monday morning and we go to print on Tuesday. That's the weekly schedule. So Sunday night, I'm in my living room in Montreal with my mother and some siblings, and we're all numb. And at the time, we just the reports were dribbling in. Is like, oh my God, I think Israel lost 100. We thought 100 was like
Yes.
a
Yes.
disaster, right? Disaster. And then we keep hearing it could be more. So I was up all night. But the cover story that we were planning that week in the Jewish Journal was a profile of Yossi Abramowitz,
Hmm.
who was one of the world leading lights of solar power. And the headline was, "Here Comes the Sun."
Hmm.
That was our cover story. So over the next 24 to 48 hours, we had to take the whole Jewish Journal, 60 pages, and completely turn it into October 7th,
Hmm.
literally. So I on the, and I was kind of caught in a whiplash. On the one hand, my heart wanted to cry, but my mind was saying, you got to redo the whole Jewish Journal. And it was like a battle between my heart and my mind. But I didn't want either one to win. I refused to let my mind win and say I'm going to just become a cold-blooded editor in chief and focus only on the task at hand. I didn't want to do that. So I was in that surreal state of doing my job and gathering all the new pieces and having to write a column myself, but at the same time
Yes.
grieving and the state of shock and all that. So it was a moment that I'll never forget in my life. And my daughter and I cancel all my meetings in New York except for one. And eventually this was like it was the week of all time.
Did you cry?
Oh yeah. Oh
Did
yeah.
you do you sob or you just cry? Because I sobbed over this one.
Yeah, I sometimes the tears just come out,
Yeah.
whether I want it or not. They just kind of come out. And if I would read, because the story was getting worse and worse and worse,
Yes, it was progressively. Yeah.
progressively worse. And yeah, the tears came out. If there was a certain horrible anecdote that I would see, yeah, yeah. Uh, and but in a way, I was almost kind of numb, and it hasn't really left me.
Right. I understand that. I get
You
that.
know, and it hasn't really left us. It's still there. And then we had to decide, what do we do on the cover. So,
Right.
uh,
What did you do?
you know, there was only one thing to do, was just make it all black.
Huh.
And the only words we had was October 7th. That
Yeah.
was it. And then my daughter said, maybe add a candle. So we did. So I'll send you one. It's actually a collector's item now.
Are these your ideas, or you have a good team that comes up with such ideas?
You know, I'm very involved with the cover every week.
Yeah.
So that's a big part of my job. I have a whole team. We gather all kinds of stuff, and I have reporters do like local stuff. So we had an emergency meeting of our staff, and get a story about these organizations. What are they doing about October 7th? And it was like we just laid out all over, and we went to all our columnists. And we didn't even have to at that point. That's all they wanted to do was change their columns that week to October 7th. So we were pushing an open door. And we realized it over the next initial weeks that we were getting inundated by columns connected to October 7th, because there was this craving to share, their soul searching. There was this. It was so earth shattering that writers, and you're a writer, writers need to share.
Yes.
And so it made it easy. But look, we had to expand the paper. And one of the things that we try to do is not to have too much overlap. I didn't want to have like the same stuff being said. So you try to have some insightful. Is We have a reporter who's, he's our political editor, and he always looks at politics. We have a woman who's, they have their own style. We even have a, a comic writer who looks at comedy, and we have a former president of university, and so we have all these different writers, and then the new writers. Gil Troy is one of our top writers from, is a professor at McGill, and everybody chipped in. Even the food writers wrote stuff that was connected.
What did they write?
Seventh, like the food for Shiva,
Ah,
and
the
why the
food. Yes.
food for Shiva. Yeah.
David,
Uh,
when I was running Via Hafta, which is a Jewish humanitarian organization in Canada, I actually founded it. And in the beginning, the first decade or so, we both had a local program or projects helping the homeless and the impoverished, of which we still do, and also an international program. So we worked in places like Zimbabwe and Guyana. We worked in Haiti. We worked together with the Israelis on humanitarian issues. I found that when a crisis would happen, that for some reason I had the natural propensity to jump in, see it very clearly, and to be able to take all the various different pieces that were required to try to fix it. As an example, we had a volunteer in Guyana who was stabbed.
mm,
Some guy was following her.
mm.
And we had to really kick in with security there, getting in touch with the parents, making sure that we went over there, et cetera, et cetera. When October 7th happened and you had a couple days to rejig the entire newspaper, is that a part of you? Can you see the whole thing in front of you and know exactly what you need to do?
Well, yeah, I mean, in a way, it wasn't that difficult because I basically said this whole paper is going to have to cover October 7th. There's one page I didn't change. We have a page called, Table for Five. And every week we take one verse from the Parsha of the week and we
Yeah.
have five different voices. All right. I decided that was going to be the one page that was going to stay. So the event was so big that it dictated my priorities. The other thing that I noticed is that there were so many initiatives that we were inundated with
Yeah.
from the community, not just in LA, but across the country. It literally happened overnight. So all these organizations, this is what we're doing, and we heard from the big ones to the small ones to individual initiatives. We started a thing called Mitzvah Roundup,
Mhm.
where there were so many initiatives and people were saying, how can we help? So now every week we have a whole spread of Mitzvah Roundup. If you want to help, from this end and that end, my daughter stopped sleeping for the first few weeks. And then they started, like shipments of supplies to Israel. And what was normally like interesting initiatives that we would have one or two or three that we would cover in the Jewish Journal, now it was like 10, 15, 20. Literally everybody stepped up and did stuff on their own. So we were inundated with these initiatives. What we had to do was just to vet them, to make sure we had the legitimate ones, and make sure it's all because we're going to recommend to our readers, this is what you can do to help. But I was in awe of the mobilization
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
the Jewish people. In awe. I
Yes,
was in
me too.
Israel.
Me
Oh
too.
my God, my sister from Montreal was there. I couldn't even see her. She was there with her daughter, volunteering, to pick up tomatoes. And I was bumping into Jews from LA who
Yes.
came with their son to volunteer, and they came from all over the world.
Mhm.
One of the columns I had written it, and I was making all these observations, going back on your point, the voice of observation, on the first phrase that you used. And I realized that my voice of observation was on overdrive,
Mhm.
right? So I was observing things that I hadn't never observed before. In America, it's not politically correct to have a tribal gene, right? Because you live in a world where inclusion is the great religion. Everybody needs to feel included. Uh, However, all of a sudden, all these Jews who, would never express their tribal gene, they're like, I'm a Jew first.
Nicely said. Yeah, nicely
I'm a
said.
Jew first. And I'm saying, whoa, that's kind of interesting. Sounds very Sephardic to me. So it was, but it was also unapologetic.
Yes.
And people were saying, I don't care whether it's politically correct or not.
Is that a correction, by the way? And what I'm asking you is, you did a really interesting discussion with a fellow by the name of Sam Yebrey in Los Angeles, who seems to be a fine human being. He's a lawyer. He works for the homeless, the impoverished. And at some point during the interview about the homeless in LA, and we'll get to that a bit later, he said, well, we're Americans first. And I have to tell you something, as Canadians, and you know this because you're Canadian, Moroccan Canadian. That is a strange phrase for us, because I think if you would get 100 Canadian Jews in a room and say to them, are you a Jew first or are you a Canadian? I think the answer would mostly be, I'm a Jew first, but not so much in America. And now you're saying is after October 7th, the response was more so first I'm a Jew. Am I seeing that correctly?
It's very interesting because in America, among the Ashkenazi Jews,
Yeah.
ones that are non-Orthodox, I guess, they're like Democrats first.
Yes. Yes.
They're political tribe.
Right.
Usually, to the extent one can generalize, it's the political tribe that's very legitimate and accepted. And among many,
Even if they're Orthodox, by the way, you hear that. Yeah, I'm
yes,
first a Democrat.
yeah, I'm a first Democrat, and I would pick, American before I'm Democrat or before I'm Republican. That's why I'm an independent. Because what's gotten lost in America is precisely what Sam Yebrey said.
Yeah.
What's gotten lost is this idea of American first, and then the truth is that one of the great things about America is America loves it when we're proud of our Jewish values and we're proud of our Jewish identity, because part of this Jewish identity is giving back. And that has been the great story of the Jews in America, has been a story of gratitude and a story of giving back. So I don't really see the conflict. The real conflict for me is when political tribe um, interferes with the national priority. So that's how I feel. But what I've noticed after October 7th was it's like everything went by the wayside. Not for everybody, but it became a clarifying moment where people said, wow, and I'm not an alarmist, it's like I try not to cry wolf too much and the rise in anti-Semitism. But look, the truth is, it's really, really gotten bad. And, we know from history that the more we're attacked, the more we get together. And at this point, it's like, I'll take it. So if this is what it took to get some unity back, then this is what it took. But it brought this. Look, there are different ways of roads to Jewish identity. One of the roads is studying of Torah. It's a deep, deep connection. Our ancestors studied Torah. The fact that we all read from the same Torah scroll after being separated for 2,000 years, and whether you're Ashkenazi or Sephardic, wherever you come from, that is a miracle to me, that we're reading from the same Torah scroll.
Yes.
Every Shabbat in every synagogue. That is a huge source of identity for a lot of Jews, especially in America. The Torah has not been enough to create this sense of identity. What October 7th brought to the picture was this other road to Jewish identity, which is peoplehood, which is I'm a member of a people. There was the daughter of a friend of mine once. She was very embarrassed. She said, I don't believe in God. And she said, I know you're very connected, but I don't believe in God. And I said, wow, that's very Jewish of you. She said, what do you mean? I said, well, in the Jewish tradition, we're called upon to ask very, very tough questions. And I said, but what's your problem? She said, well, I just don't believe in some of those stories I learned in Jewish day school. I said, because they require a leap of faith. She says, yeah, and I won't make that leap of faith. So I said, all right, I'm going to give you a miracle story now. That's a bigger miracle than the splitting of the Red Sea. And it requires absolutely no leap of faith. So it's Friday night, and I'm picking up the Kiddush cup. And I said, 1,000 years ago in some little village in Morocco, my bubbies and zadis were sitting at a table, and they lit the same Shabbat candles, and they recited the exact same Kiddush we're doing tonight.
Yes.
That requires no leap of faith. whatsoever. And it's as big a miracle as anything. And my kids have always told me that's their favorite thing I've ever said to them.
What was her response?
It's their favorite story. It's
Yeah.
their favorite story.
Yeah.
And the part that they love is when I tell them this requires no leap of faith. So what's extraordinary about Jewish peoplehood, which for people like you and I, it comes naturally. I'm a Sephardic Jew. So Jewish peoplehood, this pride of being Jewish, it's like I breathe, right?
Yes.
But for a lot of American Jews, it got lit up by October 7th. Lit up. My daughter at NYU, she's trying to put up these posters of these hostages,
Yeah.
and then she's being assaulted, with this kind of hatred. And then she's telling me, I've gotten together with a group of Jewish girls. She wasn't saying that before October 7th.
Yes.
There was a gathering of the Jews. There was a sense of, there was this, oh my God moment. They're coming after us, whether we're Reform, Hasidic, Sephardic, or conservative or Orthodox or completely disconnected Jews. They're not making any difference. So I think this is what happened that I've noticed, that sense of observation. That was one of the many observations that I tried to make. The other one was the obliteration of complexity. We're so used to wallowing in the beauty of complexity, and the truth is there's wonderful complexity. No matter what happens in the Middle East, it could be horrible, but there's always this kind of complex view. Something about October 7th obliterated nuance and complexity.
Yes.
So a lot of Jews that I know, the rug was pulled under them because they couldn't rely
Very much so.
complexity. So if they started saying, well, maybe Israel had it coming to them,
Yes.
right? And look at the occupation and the usual arguments that a lot of liberal Jews would use whenever something bad would be done to Israel from the Palestinians. All those look so foolish and irrelevant. So I think that was another thing that was kind of earth shattering. And look, I mean, to this day, things are going to slowly go back to normal. Politics are going to come back into the picture, pressure from the world, from America. And we've been seeing it in the last few weeks, that kind of some of the old moves of the past, that Israel has to be a lot more careful with with civilian deaths and the tragedy of what's happening to the Palestinian.
Or even at the Israeli cabinet meetings, you're starting to see it.
The Israel cabinet meeting, you're seeing politics re-entering the
Mhm.
picture. So there's a sense that initial numbness of October 7th is giving way to the usual, moves that we're seeing. But things are going to get hairy because, you got the danger of Hezbollah in Lebanon. So I really do think, even though we're seeing a return to some of the normal political arguments, both in America and in Israel, I do think post October 7th is a new world. And, that's got danger, but also that's got potential. It's so funny how I channel my inner Bill Sapphire. Right after 9/11, he wrote the most cold-blooded column I'd ever seen in my life. One of the things that I so loved about him is he had this ability to keep his cool. And I read his 911 column like 100 times. It's like you read it, it's dated 9/10. And I don't know what got into me, but the very first column I wrote on October 7th was we need to keep our cool as Israel. And the best way to smash and destroy Hamas and Iran, it's not enough to go in there and have war against them and demolish them physically. It's not enough. I was so angry that I went into a deeper place. I said, if we really want to destroy Hamas, we have to make peace with Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
This is their nightmare. I have to pinch myself that I actually wrote that, because I was in a state of emotional rage. I was still numb and angry, and and I didn't write that after. It was my first of 20 columns on October 7th. But the very first thing, I even have to go back and I read it now. And I said, if we really want to destroy Hamas, because this is their nightmare, the nightmare of Hamas is an Israel that is admired in the Arab world.
Yes.
And the Abraham Accord was this new vision of Israel, an Israel instead of being reviled, but an Israel that is admired in the Jewish world. So here you have these countries in the Gulf states and my, native country of Morocco that is now making, normalization deals with Israel as a sign that they really need this country. And this was the nightmare, and is one of the reasons. It was not a coincidence.
David, I'm most fascinated by human behavior. And when I started doing my research into you, there's not a lot of sort of intimate stuff out there about you, even pictures. And I'm assuming that you've met with some pretty cool people. They're limited pictures. Most of them we're putting up here during the show. But what I was able to take away was from your interviews, from your interviewing, what sort of person you are. Now, you're clearly very Sephardic in nature. What's very interesting is when you first came to Montreal from Casablanca, or a number of years later, you said, I was so surprised to meet a Jew who didn't have two eyebrows. That's a great line. That's a really good line. But I think what you've been able to do, which is something very unique, I think within the Sephardic community or most communities, that would not be considered the primary or the dominant culture, is that you've moved into the Sephardic world more of the thinking, the Lithuanian heart, but you've maintained your Sephardic emotion. Rabbi Koropkin, who's a friend of mine and a friend of yours, who was actually facilitated in putting together this interview. He's the rabbi at the Bayit Synagogue here in Toronto, one of the biggest Orthodox synagogues in the world. I asked him about you. I said, give me the lowdown on this guy. He says to me, I'll tell you something, Avram, he can keep his composure even when insulted. And I thought that was great, because I thought that really was a good reflection of the Sephardic Jew, the Moroccan Jew, who has found their way into a dramatically different culture. So this is sort of a segue into a pretty simple question. You mentioned your mother before, and that you were with her in Montreal. Tell me about your mom. Like, how old is she? Does she have a cognitive response to what's going on in Israel now?
Yeah, I mean, she cried and cried and cried. She just turned 91 years old, and her father, she was one of 11, and in the early 50s, most of them moved to Israel.
Yeah.
My mother married to a teacher. My father passed away many years ago, and they decided to move to Canada. But my mother's parents moved to Israel. Her two brothers fought in the war, 47. Um, so the connection with Israel is my grandfather, who was a pious man, prayed 3 times a day. He had a great tea business in Casablanca. You know, when Israel was born, he knew this way he was going to go, and
He
so
kissed the ground when he got there in
he kissed the
Ashkelon.
ground. He kissed the ground and said, "I'm home. I'm never leaving." So
Yeah.
even though they suffered a lot of hardships and they were given this little shack virtually, in Shikum Dromi, right outside of Ashkelon. But the narrative that I grew up with is that my grandfather kissed the ground and said, "We're home. We're never leaving." So it's built into our family narrative. So my mother cries to this day. To this day, she cries. But what's happened in Israel, it's overwhelming. She doesn't have the outlet of a Jewish journal where no
Right.
matter how much I cry, I got to put together a paper, every week. So she doesn't have that outlet, but she speaks to her family and her siblings in Israel. And look, I mean, I love the Ashkenazi world. One of the things I fell in love with about my Judaism when I left Morocco is I said, what a blessing that I live in this generation of what I call this grand family reunion.
Yes.
My grandparents never met an Ashkenazi Jew. And you go down the street where I live now in Los Angeles, it's got to be 100 different nationalities of Jews,
Yeah.
right? For me, that's the biggest blessing. So I've met, all kinds of Hasidic Jews. I've been to Uman. I've been to Crown Heights with the Chabad, who I love, and the Soloveitchik Jews from YU, and the Reformed Jews from the LGBTQ community, and these great Jews from the conservative movement, and Jews who are disconnected, and cultural Jews, and Jews who just love comedy. I mean, there's this unbelievable kaleidoscope of the Jewish community. So part of my blessing is that I don't just have to stay with the Jews I was raised with,
Yes.
And I can float between many different synagogues. I would go in the morning during Rosh Hashanah to a Sephardic shul, and then I would go for Musaf. I would go to an Ashkenazi shul because I was a member of both, and I wanted my son to see both.
But the
Right?
truth though, where do you enjoy the singing and the songs more? So the Sephardic shuls or the Ashkenazi shul?
Chazanu
Uh,
lefanecha,
Bar
ra'anu
Yochai. Yeah.
aleinu. No, I'm addicted to Sephardic davening.
And you know it by heart, right?
Addicted. It's like I call it. It's like goosebumps
Yes.
when I go to Montreal. I mean, for Yom Kippur, like we have these 15 jewels. We just sing them that day, but at the same time, I love Shlomo Carlebach and the melodies. Just I'm blown away. I just spent a month in Sfat and beautiful Hasidic melodies. There are Ashkenazi melodies that I love. So, I just find that we are an amazing people, and it is a blessing for me. And, have you heard that expression, cultural appropriation?
Yeah, I've heard it.
Now, a lot of people get really offended.
Yes, they do.
So if you're in this one group and you see somebody from another group
Yes.
culturally appropriating a thing of dress or music,
Yeah. I say take our culture, do what
oh
you
my
want with it.
God, are you
Yeah.
kidding?
Yeah.
In Pico Robertson, where I live, we culturally appropriate away all day long. My Ashkenazi friends are constantly culturally appropriating.
Right.
The
Correct.
Nigunim from Shabbat.
Yeah.
Let's sing that Sephardic song, David. And they cook the Sephardic cuisine, and we culturally appropriate from my Ashkenazi friends. So it's part of the great gift of the Jewish community is that we have so much to give to each other. And so that's how I see my kind of Sephardic Judaism. And I find that maybe because I spent so much time in the Ashkenazi world, it actually makes me feel even more Sephardic.
Yes.
And when people ask, Sephardic, it's also a spirit, to the extent that one can generalize, there's a sense of aesthetics, a sense of openness, philosophy, history. So a lot of what we brought to the Jewish Journal is a Sephardic spirit, where there's a lot of beauty in the paper, and there's poetry, and it's not just the words. And maybe I can say that comes from my Sephardic background, but we've also brought in these great Sephardic voices, scholarly voices that don't get enough attention. We have a great contributing writer, Daniel Buskila, who's written about the great Rabbi Uziel. So I think we've also opened up the boundaries where Sephardic Judaism is not just about culture and music and food and beautiful, nigunim and stuff.
It's Torah thought.
It's a lot of Torah thoughts. So
Absolutely.
this is what's been a great opportunity is a lot of Ashkenazi Jews, which is most of our readers, have learned so much more about the Sephardic contributions to Judaism.
David, Cholent or Arisa?
Cholent Depends on whether they put ketchup in it or not.
Okay.
They should have a rule in the Talmud: no ketchup in the cholent.
Right.
Oh, my mother makes an amazing dafina.
Does
Especially,
she?
it's great. Yeah, yeah, she does, and especially in the Montreal winters. I mean, in LA, it's not as popular, especially if you want to be able to walk later.
David, why do they hate us so much?
Oh well, that's the question of questions. Um,
Because we're hated a lot.
we are. I think there definitely there's an obsession with the Jews. Uh, Look, before the Jews came on, there wasn't one God. One God. It's a very threatening idea. One God. They had a field day before us, and anybody could be your God, and the pagans, and this is God, this is God, this is God, this is God. So you start with that idea, and a God that appeals to our conscience and our morality. It's very threatening. It's, and then look, I mean, the biggest religion in the world accused us of killing their God. That wasn't good. We were not supposed to stick to our 613 commandments. We were supposed to follow Paul or Saul. We're supposed to follow along. This is the New Testament. We're supposed to follow. So it was very insulting and offensive. We're not following. You guys do what you want. We're sticking to our 613, but wait a minute. We don't need the laws anymore. Come on in. This is the new thing. We say, no, no, no. We like the laws. So as long as we survived with the laws, we were a constant threat that this new religion called Christianity may be wrong.
Hmm. Hmm.
It may be completely wrong, right? So we were this visible symbol. That's why they had to say any suffering that we went, the pogroms, the persecution, was God punishing us. They had to frame it. They had to frame our suffering. You see, it's because they didn't follow our religion. So it goes all the way back, And then the fact that we Jews were the first to talk to God, it's a very offensive idea for a lot of people. We're the chosen people. How dare you, right? So then, we became after we lost the second temple was destroyed, we became a people of education, a people of software, of books, of conscience, of morality. We made everybody look bad. We were the conscience. So we were the teacher's pet in class. Who likes teacher's pet? Who likes them? You're like, yuck. So we were a little bit teacher's pet. That's how we were seen. And how many stories do you see in 1900 years of pogroms, of like the Jewish crusaders who ransacked and massacred tens of thousands in villages, and then the Jews who did the pogroms against this group or that group? I've been looking for those stories. I still haven't found them. So, forgive me for not apologizing for that, but we were not a vicious, violent people that had obvious sins. So we were the conscience of humanity, and people had to find something wrong with us, and they did, and they blamed us for everything, and that's how it started. Now, when we got a reprieve, when we lost 6 million, we said, we got to back off of these guys now.
Yeah,
Let's
that's true.
let's give them 20, 30 years.
Yes.
Come on. They lost 6 million, so they didn't have their favorite scapegoat for a few decades. But now that scapegoat is back with a vengeance because of Israel, right? So this is the status quo, is Jews as the world's favorite scapegoat. The thing that's happened differently is the coming of America. Because Mika Goodman said a very interesting thing. He said, there was two great dreams in the Jewish tradition, And one dream was to return home to Zion, and the other great dream was to find a country that would accept us as equals.
Mhm.
And both of those dreams came true in the same century, Israel and America. So look, I mean, America kind of threw a monkey wrench in the, Jews as the world's favorite scapegoat. There was anti-Semitism, but this was not the darkness of the anti-Semitism that we experienced for 1900 years. This was like Jerry Seinfeld. This was like, we're like the coolest people in America. We're like Sid Caesar and Saul Bellow, and you got hundreds and hundreds, and then you got these Jewish lawyers who would hitchhike to Mississippi in the 60s and fight for the rights of blacks, and this Jewish guy Rosenwald who created NAACP, and the coolest actors and comedians and authors. It's like, whoa, this is not your ordinary country where we're insecure and it was the exact opposite. I used to tell my cousins from France, they would come every summer. I would say, in America, it's kind of cool to be Jewish. I'd say, you're out of your mind, right? America is the very first country where you could say it's kind of cool to be Jewish. So this was a whole new experience. Of course, unfortunately, October 7th has kind of changed that, even that. But fundamentally, there was this incredible love affair between the Jews and America. It's still there. It's still there. The word Israel and Zionism has tainted that. But the word Jewish has always had a certain flair, a certain something. And I think one of the reasons it's had a certain something is precisely because of what you and I talked about at the very beginning of the show, which is this diversity of thought within the Jews, this Talmudic approach to embracing different viewpoints. So the Jews in America have been tremendously diverse. I mean, including Jews that drive me nuts, that are far left, and all the way to the right. So I think, in a way, we were the best of America in many ways. And now there's a new initiative out of Yeshiva University. It's called, Restoring the American Story. And then the more you dig into that, there is a piece I did on that, how fighting anti-Semitism is good for America, because there is a built-in connection between America and Judaic values, right? That's being lost right now. And I think there's an opportunity to kind of bring that back. So there's a very deep bond between Jews, Judaism, and America that makes the experience of American Jewry something different.
David, I want to pick up on what you're saying here about fighting anti-Semitism. You and I both know that there have been probably billions of dollars spent on Holocaust museums in major metropolitan cities across North America and otherwise. We have implemented programs of sending kids to Israel, sending kids to Poland, to Auschwitz. There is one could argue that a main focus of the Jewish people for many years was indeed the Holocaust, and subsequently educating the world about what that meant. And then comes along October 7th, David. And the proliferation of anti-Semitism that we all see is astounding to most of us.
It really is.
I have to ask the question, and I'm so curious about how you approach this. Did we do a really, really good job of educating, let's say, the non-Jew, but unfortunately we didn't have enough resources, or we didn't get out there enough? Or are we not doing it right?
Well, I think you have a conflict, a cognitive dissonance, because the reality is that Jews have done very, very well in America. I don't mean this as a negative stereotype. Just mean that traditionally the Jewish ways, you really, 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 really work hard, and you want your kid to get to a good college and do well, and all that kind of stuff. So the better you do in America, the less people are going to buy the argument that you're a victim. We don't make good victims. And I think what happened with the Holocaust is we put such a huge importance on, 80 years ago we were victims, 70 years ago we lost 6 million. So on the one hand, people are saying, well, it's horrible, but what I'm seeing here in America is the exact opposite. I don't see any Holocaust happening in America. So there was a disconnect between this whole look what happened to us and look how powerful and successful the Jews are in America. So we could never hope that a Holocaust education was going to sensitize people to the vulnerability of Jews, because what Americans were seeing was the exact opposite of vulnerable people. They saw very successful people. Now, something happened a few years ago that really hurt the Jews. America used to be a country where success was a great thing, where if somebody's successful, you admire them and you emulate them. We're not a class-based society like in Europe. But a few years ago, something terrible happened. This is directly from Bret Stephens, from a class he gave a few months ago here in LA. The word success became white privilege. Mm-hmm. When the word success became white privilege, it became a very, very bad, that was a bad day for the Jews.
Yes.
Because all of a sudden, they tainted something great, something that we aspired to. Who knew that people would hold our success against us by spinning it as white privilege? And from that day on, it's been very difficult for us to recover, because the Jews have gotten sucked in to this woke narrative where there's only two classes of people in this new America. There's the oppressed and the oppressors. And we got lumped in to the oppressors. And as long as you're in that group of oppressor, you can't get out. Mm-hmm. And we're the ultimate white oppressors because we're seen as the ultimate in successful Americans, right? So we got trapped into that box. What happened with October 7th is it kind of shook that up a little bit. It's like, oh my God, the oppressors have been massacred. So it created this disconnect. And I think among the woke world, they panicked. Mm-hmm. And they said, you're shattering this model that we live on. You're not supposed to be the oppressed. So part of what we saw in those first week or two was with this pro-Hamas riots all over America was this Jew hatred movement was telling all the Jewish students on college campuses, go back into your box of oppressors. Don't you think you're going to come into our box of oppressed? The last thing the Jews are a marginalized minority of oppressed people. And we've really gotten hurt by this oversimplified, kind of very insidious and corrosive, un-American kind of dichotomy of oppressed and oppressors.
What do we do about it?
Well, I think here's what we don't do about it. Let's not try to play the victim Olympics, because the reason we've succeeded, the reason any human being succeeds is when you shed your mentality of being a victim. You speak to any shrink, any psychologist, you read any book on the subject, and they say one of the worst things you can do is to, treat yourself like a victim, even when you really are a victim, right? Yes. So I think there's a real trap right now where Jews are trying to play the victim Olympics and asking, for kind of protection. Now, having said all that, there are physical harassment, intimidation and bullying, things that really are not free speech, not even hate speech. It crosses the line into harassment. And I think this is the big mistake that those presidents of universities, Ivy Leagues did. They couldn't separate the line between free speech and harassment. For that, we need to fight back. There are legal ways of fighting back, and I'm all for fighting back. But we need to fight back like winners, not whiners.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. David, just a few things that I want to touch on before we wrap up. By the way, I've been enjoying the interview a lot.
Likewise.
I like you. I think you're my new friend, and I really appreciate your thoughtfulness on this. Just a couple of things. One of the issues that I mentioned before that you have faced, excuse me, is homelessness in Los Angeles. And I really am touching on this because I want to know more about David Suissa in the context of the different places that you've lived in the world. In Canada, in Montreal or Toronto, there is homelessness, but the numbers are not near what they are in Los Angeles. So, as a Jew, Jewish writer, as a Jewish leader, at some point in time, you decided that you were going to spend a little time down in Skid Row.
Yeah.
And you went down there with a camera and you wrote about it.
Yeah.
And you met somebody, a Jewish woman by the name of Natalie Levine, who was out there. Who was Natalie Levine?
I came out of a cafe on Pico one morning and I had to rush to my car to get to the office. And I saw a woman sleep on the sidewalk. And it's rare to see them like right in the middle. And I don't know why. It was really bothering me. So I came back and I'm just going to give her $1. And then, she got up. I said, on a whim, I said, "What's your name?" She said,
I have Natalie Levine.
Natalie Levine. Natalie
Yeah.
Levine. This was a
Yeah.
few years ago. I said, "Are you Jewish?" So she said, "Yeah, I'm Jewish." I started filming her and I spent like 10 minutes with her and I filmed her. When I got back to the office, you know, I looked at the film and then I was really angry at myself because I didn't make any plans to see her. I said, I can't just leave her alone. So I went back later that day looking for her. I couldn't find her and I was really upset. And then I drove up and down Pico. Finally, I found her. I never thought I would be so happy finding a homeless. So he said, "Hey, Natalie, maybe I can help you." So, long story short, I spent 4 months like helping her. And I have a group of people together and they helped me. And then we brought her into a place and she took a shower. And then I was like, I have some connections in town. So I was like at this fancy cocktail party at Chaim Saban's house. And I bump into Zev Yaroslavsky, who's like a legend, a local legend. And I said, "Zev, I met this Jewish homeless woman. Can you help?" And he was very involved with the homeless crisis. So he gave me a name, and I called next day. And next thing you know, one thing led to another. And it turns out that they had a place in Santa Monica, that was like 24/7 with psychiatric care. And it's like, and I got her in and she's still there.
Yes.
Years later. So that was just a thing. The other stuff on going to Skid Row, I was always fascinated by homeless. I can't explain why. I would just go there on Fridays and I would film them and I would always ask them the same question. What was your dream when you grew up, when you were a kid? What did you dream about? I would go inside these tents and just ask them. Never really did anything with it. It was just, it wasn't that bad then, but it's become such an insidious problem. And it's so sad. It's so sad because, you never feel that there's some real competence among the leadership to really come up with
Yeah.
solutions. There's a tremendous amount of money that's thrown at the problem. And then they end up, it costs like $900,000 for a unit to live. Like, there was this guy Schallenberger, San Francisco, a few years ago. He really shook things up. He wrote the book on how to take care of the real homeless problem. And I encourage anybody who wants to have some real hardcore solutions to read that book. But we've gone away from the practical solutions because America has become a very soft country where we worry a lot about just compassion and feelings. So it's about feelings rather than solutions. And I think California has suffered from that because we haven't had the kind of leadership that takes a practical look at reducing crime and reducing homelessness to the point that San Francisco's now it's like a dark city.
Yes.
It's horrible.
Yeah.
So, and I say this not as left wing or right wing, not as Democrat or Republican. Somebody who looks for solutions. So it's really a sad thing that's happened because a lot of Jews have left. A lot of Californians have left. They've moved to Florida and Texas and Arizona, and some have moved to Israel. So it's kind of sad. But having said all of that, I'm still a Los Angeles, love, love, love LA. It's got an amazing Jewish community. But the homeless crisis is really, really a sad state.
I think the thing that's nice about you is that you're a bit like Joseph in the Bible, where you're a bit of a wanderer. I think Joseph clearly loved Egypt, but he loved being with his brothers in Canaan. And I find that you're very eclectic in nature. You're somewhat a man of the world, both Morocco, both Montreal. You lived in Toronto for a while and also in LA. Now, in conclusion, um, I want to ask, a few weeks ago, I interviewed Noah Braun, whom I mentioned at the top of the show. Noah is a beautiful man, beautiful, beautiful human being who started up Israel's Guide Dog Center for the Blind. Now, you can imagine how his day is spent in a very magical, special way, not only helping human beings, but doing something for dogs, for animals, and of course, in the bigger pictures for the state of Israel. So during the interview, he said to me something which stuck. And that was, he said, Avrum, one of the nice things about working with the Israel Guide Dog Center for 40 years is every morning I wake up, I know what I'm going to do. I know that I'm excited about it. I can't wait for it. And I jump out of bed. So my question to you is, I'm assuming we're similar generations, not so far off in age. Is that where your life is? Like, are you excited about the rest of it? Or is there some question as how am I going to do this? The latter phases of my life.
It's a real blessing to be a writer. On my way to Israel, I had some real problems with the flights, long story. And I was stuck for like a couple of days somewhere. And I said, what a blessing, because I'm just going to write for 2 days. I think it's a blessing to wake up in the morning and feel a sense of purpose.
Yeah.
And when the purpose also gives you joy. I think Avrum Joshua Heschel said the greatest need we have is to become a need. And I think one of life's true blessings is when you feel needed. And I feel needed. Your friend Noah, he feels needed. He's created a thing where people really need him, and you could be needed by a small group of people or a large group of people. But the idea of, you reach a stage in your life where you feel needed. And that's how I feel. And, I feel needed by doing something that I love. With all the crying that I had to do post October 7th, that I still do, with all the darkness that we've been forced to confront, there's still at the core a sense of feeling needed, and that brings me deep satisfaction.
So would you say mostly needs you? 1 to 3.
Who mostly needs you? Well, of course, my children.
Yeah.
First, and I think the Jews in LA who look forward, because I see it everywhere I go in this town. They said, David, every Shabbos, I'm there with my family, with the Jewish Journal. Oh, yeah. And if there's one day I don't bring it home, my wife won't talk to me, blah, blah, blah. So that brings me the deepest pleasure when I hear that Jews all over LA just look forward to picking up the Jewish Journal. I feel needed by them.
Very good. Very good. David Suissa, I want to thank you so much for being with us. I really, truly enjoyed our interview.
My pleasure.
You're a fascinating man. Fascinating. You know what I like about you is that you're a very hopeful Jew. Very hopeful Jew.
I am.
Yeah.
I
Even your face reflects that. Sometimes you'll meet one of our brothers, and they're like, no, it's not so good. Things won't get better. You don't have that look.
No, hope is my oxygen.
It really is. So thank you for being with us. I really appreciate it. I want to thank all of our viewers as well, our listeners. If you'd like to know more about the podcast, about my art, about things that I'm doing, please take a look at avrumrosensweig.com. This show was being live streamed on Facebook as well as on YouTube, and I would very much, if you would appreciate, if you would subscribe to the YouTube channel. That's really helpful in terms of the development of the show. As I said, we have some great, great shows coming up. I'm doing a couple roundtables. In 3 weeks from now, I'm going to have Rabbi Koropkin on from the Bayit Synagogue. Michael Kegel is a well-known philosopher. Matthew Freuer, also a local philosopher. And I think what we're going to try to do is we're going to talk about some philosophical issues like justice. And I know you're falling asleep when I say that, but the hook of the show is that we're going to bring it down a level, almost like a Will Durant approach to philosophy, and try to make it accessible for everybody. So I want you to tune into that because it's going to be fascinating. I'm also going to be doing a roundtable with people over 95 years old, because there is nothing like the elderly. David, like your mother, is 91. God bless her. So we have some really cool stuff coming up. Once again, thank you for joining us. You've been listening to the Avrum Rosensweig Show, a podcast about ordinary folk, really extraordinary stories. And my guest today has been David Suissa, who's the publisher and editor-in-chief of the Jewish Journal. Once again, David, thank you so much. I appreciate it very much.
My pleasure.
I'm Yisrael Chai.
I'm Yisrael Chai.